morning. My name is Susan Cosio, and I've had the pleasure of being part of this congregation for over 25 years. I received my call to seminary within the midst of this congregation, went on to be ordained as a covenant pastor, and serve in full-time ministry as a hospital chaplain in Sacramento. One of the other communities that I'm a part of here in Davis is Fit House. As you can imagine, the work of a chaplain can be a bit stressful, and so I find that exercise helps me relieve some of my distress. So recently I was in a yoga class, and a woman next to me asked me what I did for a living. I could literally see the color drain from her face when I told her that I was a hospital chaplain. She said, "Wow, that's intense." I didn't know what else she was thinking, but the word she used was intense. And it can be. As I sat there, I reflected on the night before when I'd been on call, and I'd been paged into the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning. Had to drive across the causeway to Sacramento, not knowing exactly what to expect. I got into the parking garage, left the parking garage, stepped over a homeless man at the base of the stairs, walked across the street, and walked into the emergency room that was crowded with people speaking a number of different languages, but everybody with a universal expression of distress on their faces. There was a woman who was mentally ill who was screaming at the security guard, and I had to walk around her to go to the back to see the patient I'd been called in to see. A young woman, a college student, who was bleeding internally for unknown reasons and was just clinging to life. So as I sat on my yoga mat thinking about this, the woman next to me asked a follow-up question. "Do you do normal ministry on Sundays too?" I laughed like you. I wasn't sure exactly what normal ministry is. Did she mean real ministry? Did she mean legitimate ministry? Or did she just mean traditional ministry? You know, the kind of things that we do here on Sunday mornings inside the church walls. I try not to be offended when somebody makes a comment like that. After all, I used to have the same mindset. When I was called to seminary, I assumed I was going to be a church pastor. That was the equation in my mind. Seminary leads to church ministry. But along the way, God began to make it clear that I was uniquely called and equipped to the work of a hospital chaplain. Now that is a story in and of itself, but I'll have to save that for another time. Today, I am encouraged by our passage in Mark chapter 5. You know why? Because it reminds me of the legitimacy of ministry outside the church walls, and because it shows us just how far Jesus' compassionate reach extends. In last week's passage, you may recall that we saw Jesus sitting by the lake, teaching a more traditional pastoral role. And this week, we see him go across the lake to the other side. Mark chapter 5 records 3 dramatic, compassionate healings. They center around 3 very different people in 3 different circumstances. So this morning I've invited 3 people from our congregation to serve as scripture readers. We're going to look at each story one at a time and then collectively explore what we have to learn from them. We'll begin with the story of Jesus' first excursion into non-Jewish territory. He and his disciples traveled across the sea to the territory of the Gerasenes, where Jesus has a strange encounter with a demon-possessed man.
They went across the lake.
Lots of power in the story.
They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside. And the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. And they were afraid.
The territory of the Gerasenes sounds like a pretty eerie place, even in the daylight. Maybe even more intimidating than the emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning. The lifestyle and the customs of this Gentile region would have seemed foreign to Jesus and his Jewish disciples. And this place, in particular, would have been seen as doubly unclean because it contained both pigs and tombs. There were a number of caves lining the coastline, and many of them were used to bury the dead. So as Jesus steps out of the boat and onto the shore, this demon-possessed man comes running toward him, wide-eyed, shouting, flailing his arms, naked, bearing the marks of self-mutilation. An unclean spirit has inhabited his body and taken over, resulting in a life of unbearable torment. He can no longer function in society, so he lives among the tombs. The people in his community have tried to solve this man's problems, but it's futile. The most they can do is attempt to restrain him using chains, but even that has proven to be completely ineffective. Only Jesus can bind Satan and set this man free. Only Jesus has the power and the authority over the forces of destruction within the human person. This is an amazing display of Jesus' power and authority. And yet we know if we look ahead, it's just a taste. Because Jesus will ultimately show even greater authority at a tomb in his own resurrection from the dead. But instead of being amazed and impressed and inspired by what they see, the people of this region are terrified, it says. They are afraid. In the next few verses, they plead with Jesus to leave their region, to just get out. The man who is healed wants to go with Jesus. But Jesus says no. He says, you need to stay here and tell your story. And this man becomes the first missionary to the Decapolis, a significant 10-city region on the east side of the Jordan. Jesus then returns to the Jewish side of the lake, of the Sea of Galilee, and he facilitates 2 more dramatic healings. He's first approached by a man named Jairus, who is a synagogue official. Jairus comes to Jesus pleading. He says, my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter, is critically ill at home in bed. He asks Jesus, please come and lay hands on her. And Jesus agrees immediately. He sets off to go see this little girl. But before he can even get there, he encounters a woman who's hemorrhaging, who's also desperate for healing.
And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And once Jesus realized the power had gone out from him, he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you can ask, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.
It's an interesting interruption. Jesus is off to do what we might consider a more respectable, legitimate ministry, visiting the synagogue official's little girl. But on the way, he encounters a bleeding woman who breaks all taboos and boldly touches him. I wonder if in our 21st century American Christian mindset, we understand the power of this encounter. See, the woman, remember, she would have had absolutely no standing in her culture simply because she was a woman. And then, add to this, she is ceremonially unclean, according to Mosaic law, because of the flow of blood. She's been bleeding for 12 years, which is as long as Jairus' daughter has been alive. And because of this, she is not allowed to touch anyone. She's not even allowed to go into the temple to worship with God's people. She must have experienced a deep sense of alienation, isolation, abandonment, futility. No one could cure her. She had spent all of her money seeking out medical treatment, and she encountered painful treatments that did nothing to cure her, only increased her suffering. But when in faith, she reaches out and touches the hem of Jesus' garment, she touches into his power, and she's healed. And then Jesus turns to her and affectionately calls her daughter. And when he does this, he heals her not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually, even relationally. Because once she's no longer unclean, she can be restored to her community. Jesus invites this woman to go in peace. And for the first time in 12 years, she can. Our third story records the most dramatic healing yet. And it shows us Jesus' power and authority even over death. It's the greatest miracle Jesus has performed so far, and he does it for a 12-year-old girl.
While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat.
It's interesting to me that the most dramatic healing involves a child and a little girl at that. How often Jesus tends to do the most for those who are considered the least of these. But the little girl dies before Jesus can get there. It sounds like a lot like the story of Lazarus. The professional mourners have gathered around the home and they're wailing loudly. And when Jesus arrives and tells them to have faith, they just mock at him. They ridicule him because in their eyes, the child's death is tragic and unsolvable. There's no solution. It's futile to even go into the house. But Jesus crosses the threshold. He walks into the little girl's room. He stands by her bed. He takes her hand. And he invites her to get up. And immediately she stands up and begins to walk. Her parents and the disciples who are in the room are astonished. But Jesus says, "Don't say anything. Just give her something to eat." So what do we learn from these three stories about Jesus and about his ministry? Well, clearly, one of the themes of the Gospel of Mark is Jesus' healing ministry. Clearly, Jesus is divine because he performs miracles that only God can do. He has power and authority over demons, over self-destruction, over disease, even over death. Another thing that I notice in these stories is that Jesus does not discriminate between deserving and undeserving people. Social status seems to mean nothing to him. The man in the tombs is just as worthy of his time as the synagogue official's daughter. Jesus chooses to minister outside the boundaries of his faith community. He's not afraid to go to the tombs. He leaves what he's doing to respond to the synagogue official, but then he lets himself be interrupted by the needs of the bleeding woman. He chooses to touch the untouchable, the crazed, and demon-possessed. Those on the other side, the bleeding woman, the dying, even the dead. No one is untouchable to Jesus. No one is outside of his loving care. I'm also struck that his ministry is holistic. It's what in the hospital we might call integrated or interdisciplinary. Jesus is not just interested in the physical needs, but in the spiritual and emotional needs of those that he heals. He's interested in restoring relationships and community. He even cares about food. And yet he doesn't have a rigid agenda or a timeline. He sees interruptions as opportunities. He stops to minister to a stranger along the way to somewhere else. That is a very good lesson. And the observers of Jesus' ministry are often skeptical and afraid of what they see. So they choose to distance themselves from Jesus. The Gerasenes ask him to leave, to get out of their territory. The mourners mock him, and as a result, they cannot be present for the resurrection of the little girl. But those who are healed, they recognize his power and his authority, and they are desperate to get close to him. They plead with him. They go to him. They fall prostrate. They grab the hem of his garment. They allow Jesus to touch them. And in every case, he responds to their desperate pleas, and he makes them well. There seems to be a purpose in what he does, even if we can't quite understand it. He tells this exorcised man to testify to the Decapolis, and yet he tells the little girl's parents not to say a thing. I'm also struck that each of the people in these stories seem like a hopeless case. No one can subdue the man with demons, even with chains. The woman has been bleeding for 12 years and no one can cure her. Jesus arrives to the little girl's house after she's dead. There appears to be no hope left, and yet Jesus heals them all. In medicine, we sometimes face dilemmas of cases that we call futile care, where continued treatment seems to be not worth the effort or the cost because the person is not expected to survive. As a chaplain, I find it challenging to know how to respond to these situations. Should I pray for a miracle, as people ask me to? Or is it my job as a palliative care chaplain to help them accept their prognosis and prepare for the inevitable? I get requests for many kinds of prayer. 100-year-old patients who want to continue to live. Patients on the transplant list who ask us if it's okay to pray that somebody else will die so they can get a new heart. Neglectful parents who pray that CPS will not remove their children from their care. Is there a right way to pray in these circumstances? I've spoken to parents at the hospital whose children are diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, who insist that God will not let their child die. The oncologists tell me that the child has weeks, maybe even days to live. So do I pray against all odds for the miracle the parents are hoping for? Should I pray for a 22-week preemie in the NICU? Should I pray that the 35-year-old, the man who's been struggling with drug and alcohol addiction for 35 years, will overcome and come clean with God's help? Should I pray that God will cure the schizophrenic woman who attends the spirituality group at the psych center? Shall I pray that the young man who's paralyzed in a car accident will walk again? Is there hope for healing in these situations? Or should I pray that God will give them the courage and the strength to face their circumstances? We talk about futile care. Is there any such thing as futile prayer? Jim Cymbala wrote a book called Fresh Wind, Fresh Fire, and he's written a new book that he calls Storm. And in that book, he suggests that evangelical Christians are no longer people of prayer. He says that we don't pray because we don't expect God to answer our prayers. And he says that our doubt about prayer is tied to our doubt in God's love for us. He says we may think we're too far gone, or that Jesus just doesn't care enough about our specific circumstances to respond. Is that true? Are there some things in our lives, some people in our lives, some things about ourselves or our circumstances that we think are futile, no longer going to change, beyond God's ability to heal, not even worth praying about? This week, I was in Denver at a Covenant Pastors Conference, and I had a conversation with another pastor who attended a workshop that I facilitated. He came up to me and he said, I've been struggling with headaches and chronic pain for 14 years. And he admitted to me that somewhere along the line, he stopped praying. And he stopped asking other people to pray for him too. He said it was a combination of acceptance and resentment. He just figured that God had decided he wasn't going to do anything about it. It was the thorn in his side, or his cross to bear. But then this young pastor started tearing up as he told me what happened a few months ago. when a group from his church came and asked if they could lay hands on him and pray for him every day for 7 days. He said, I humbled myself, and I let them do it. And it was a turning point in his life and in his ministry. God doesn't always give us what we ask for. There are times when our hopes are disappointed. I know that there are those of you in this room who prayed fervently for a miracle that God did not grant. I prayed with and for many of you. And I weep for you in your pain and in your loss. Even as a pastor and a chaplain, I have to admit, I have a lot of questions about what I see every day and about what I don't see. Just recently, I was in the pediatric intensive care unit with an 11-year-old girl who's dying of bone cancer. Her parents are Christians, and they're praying for a miracle, and they asked me to pray over her. And when I did, I so wanted to sense Jesus walking into the room. I wanted to hear him call her name and tell her to get up. But so far, that hasn't happened. But these stories in Mark chapter 5, they reassure me that we do have a God who cares. We have a God who comes. We have a God who comforts when he doesn't cure. When I read the stories of the Bible, I'm tempted to assume that Jesus cured everybody, that he healed everybody. But, we have to remember that even in his earthly ministry, Jesus was limited by time and geography. His earthly ministry lasted only 3 years, and he only got to where he could walk. Sure, there were some people, like these people in Mark chapter 5, that were healed miraculously, but there must have been other people along the way or in the crowd who never received his healing touch, who maybe even didn't meet him. Does this mean that some people are loved more and some people loved less by God? Does this mean that those who don't have enough faith or enough standing can't get Jesus' attention? Absolutely not. The Gospel of Mark tells us, shows us Jesus' compassion for all, regardless of status or circumstance. We don't need to doubt his love or his power. There is no such thing as a hopeless circumstance. Prayer is never futile. It's true that our prayers will not all be answered when and how we want them to be. Sometimes restoration comes in the midst of our earthly agony when we feel enchained and enslaved by the demons and the self-destructive tendencies in our lives. Sometimes there's only a glimpse of healing after many years. And sometimes healing comes only after death, when we or our loved ones meet Jesus face to face. People ask me if I see miracles in the hospital. And every once in a while, a physician will admit, I didn't think that guy was going to survive. But that's not the only kind of miracle God can do. Sometimes there's no physical cure, but there's evidence of spiritual renewal or relational reconciliation or other evidence that God is still at work. Sometimes the miracle is that we don't lose hope, that we reach out and we hold on to Jesus and that we hold on to our faith, even in the midst of our pain and our struggle. The first step is to humbly acknowledge our desperate need and run after him. I've asked Patty Bryant this morning to come and share briefly a testimony from her own life.
About a month ago, when Matt asked the congregation if anyone wanted to share what God was doing in their life, I felt called to do so. After the service, I went home, and this testimony poured out of me. However, as I stand here today, I feel exposed and vulnerable and fearful of your judgment. But more than that, I feel called to be obedient to God and to care more about obedience to God than what man thinks about me. this is one way that God is working through me. So here I am, pressing through my fear. For too many years, I remained stuck in misery and self-pity. I thought I had good reasons. As a child, I was neglected, emotionally and sexually abused. My first suicide attempt was at age 10. Eventually, I became addicted to drugs, and I didn't even realize it until I was in college, the first week, and went through withdrawals. But that didn't last long, because I found new people that could hook me up. My suicide attempts continued, and I developed an eating disorder and was very depressed. I suffered from flashbacks, and I still have PTSD that haunts me almost weekly as I wake up screaming in my sleep. After much counseling and renewal, I thought my life would be great. I eventually found God at age 30, and at 31 I had my first child. Each year for the next 8 years of my daughter's life, we saw a series of medical professionals due to health issues she had. The stress was intense, my marriage suffered, the depression returned, and the desire to live faded. In the 49 years I have lived, I've only had a few years of happiness. But that is changing, because God is doing an amazing work in me. I realized that nothing in my life was going to change until the discomfort of remaining the same was greater than the discomfort of change. So with that in mind, I pressed through, and I continue to press through and find victory in overcoming difficulties. I also search for joy and peace during the trials. Last year, our family went through a major crisis. My husband and I went in to talk with Doug, and I had been meditating on a passage in the Bible from Colossians 1:11, which says, "We pray that you may be strengthened and invigorated with all power according to the might of his glory, to exercise every kind of endurance and patience with joy." Paul is praying that the Colossians will endure with joy. So given our situation, I asked Doug, how is it possible to pray with joy? During that year-long intense struggle, I sought to find joy everywhere. It was hard, often very hard. Sometimes I found comfort in a stranger's smile or in planting flowers. God's beautiful flowers actually brought me so much joy that I transformed our entire backyard. These simple things reminded me that there was good in the world, even though my world felt painful and out of control. Now that the struggle has ended and we've come full circle, I can rejoice with joy for the work God has done in our family, and I would never go back to where we were before the crisis. See, God uses all this stuff in our life to shape us to become more like Him. I may not have had a good start in life, but I'm going to finish well. I must remember that if God is for us, who can be against us? And that I am a daughter of the Most High and live in that strength. I won't let the devil steal my joy anymore. I will be like the woman in the crowd who Mark talks about in chapter 5, verses 24 through 34, who's been bleeding for 12 years and tried everything, but had not given up. She presses through the crowd to Jesus and receives her miracle. I will continue to actively seek out Jesus to be my healer, my strength, my comfort, and my friend. I've learned to stop asking God to get me out of my circumstances and instead to make me more like Him. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Patty. We have a God of compassion who comes to us and heals the broken places in our lives.